Just after 2 in the morning, a freight train moved through the dark, following tracks it had already travelled for hours without a single problem. Signal after signal had stayed green, the night quiet and uneventful. Then, near a place called Jumperkine, one signal changed, and the train kept going. What happened next wasn't loud, sudden, or expected, but it would leave one of Australia's busiest rail corridors forever changed. This is the story of 2019 collision between freight trains at Jumperkine, Western Australia. The final investigation report released on the 15th of February 2024, and in this documentary, we take a deep dive into that final report to understand how this disaster unfolded and why it matters. Jumperkine is a small and quiet railway location in Western Australia, surrounded by bushland and open country. There are no nearby towns, no streetlights, and no buildings to light the area at night. This section of railway is part of a major freight route linking Western Australia with the rest of the country. The track at Jumperkine is a mixed-gauge corridor, meaning different types of trains use the same route. Because of this, traffic is carefully controlled using signals and radio communication. This railway does not have automatic train protection. There is no system that can automatically stop a train if a driver misses a red signal. Safety depends almost entirely on the driver seeing the signals and responding correctly. On this night, 2 freight trains were moving along the same railway line, each doing a routine job that thousands of trains had done before without incident. The first train was known as 7MP5. It was a long intermodal freight train carrying shipping containers across Western Australia. The train was about 1,070 metres long, stretching nearly a full kilometre from front to back. It was being operated by a single driver, working alone in the cab. The second train was 2K66, a heavily loaded grain service carrying harvested grain toward Perth. Unlike 7MP5, this train was not moving. It had been brought to a stop at Jumperkine to allow another freight train to pass safely on a nearby track. Its crew was waiting, unaware that another train was approaching from behind. After leaving the last crossing point, the journey settled into a long and quiet stretch. For more than 2 hours, the train travelled about 158 kilometres without needing to slow down or stop. During that entire time, the signals ahead stayed the same. One after another, 33 signals all showed green. Each green signal told the driver it was safe to continue. There was no need to brake, no reason to prepare to stop, and no change in the routine. The train simply kept moving forward through the night, following a pattern that had repeated itself many times before. Over time, this kind of steady running can change how a person expects the road ahead to behave. When nothing changes for so long, the mind begins to assume that nothing will change at all. The work becomes quiet, repetitive, and predictable. At Jumperkine, the system worked the way it was supposed to. The signals changed correctly, and the warning was given in advance. The yellow signal appeared first, telling the driver that a stop was coming. The red signal ahead was protecting another train that was already stopped on the track. As the train approached Jumperkine, the warning came exactly as the system intended. At 1:56 in the morning, the first signal showed yellow. This was the sign to slow down and prepare to stop. The train passed it while continuing at speed. 3 minutes later, at 1:59, the next signal came into view. This signal was red. It was placed there to protect a train that was already stopped ahead. The freight train passed this red signal at about 72 kilometers per hour. There was no braking. There was no change in speed. There was no sign that the driver realized anything was wrong. However, there was an important limitation. This section of railway did not have a system that could automatically stop a train. If a driver failed to respond to a red signal, nothing would step in to slow the train or apply the brakes. There was no automatic backup. According to the final investigation, the driver was almost certainly unaware that the red signal had been passed. The train continued forward without authority, moving into a section of track it was never meant to enter. After passing the red signal, the train continued along the track in darkness. Ahead, another freight train was standing still, but it could not be seen right away. The track curved, and the night offered no extra light beyond the train's own headlights. It was only when the track straightened that the rear of the stopped train came into view. At that moment, the driver finally reacted and applied the emergency brakes. By then, there was only about 175 meters left between the two trains. That distance was not enough. Even with the emergency braking fully applied, the train could not stop in time. A few seconds later, it struck the rear of the stationary train at about 41 kilometers per hour. At this point, the outcome was unavoidable. The impact caused severe damage to the front of the moving train. The driver's cab was heavily crushed, and grain from the stopped train's wagons broke through and entered the cabin. The force of the collision left very little protection for the person inside. The driver of the freight train was fatally injured. No warning system, no late braking, and no emergency response could change the outcome at that point. A routine night journey had ended in loss of life. Behind the broken locomotive, grain spilled from the broken wagons onto the track. The stopped train's crew felt the impact, but did not immediately know what had happened behind them. In the darkness and confusion, it took time for the full reality of the situation to become clear. After the collision, attention turned to the safety systems that were meant to prevent something like this from happening. Several layers of protection were in place, but none of them were able to stop the train in time. The locomotive's vigilance system was operating as designed. It checked that the driver was making regular physical inputs, but it could not tell whether the driver had seen or understood the signals. As long as the system was acknowledged, it did not intervene. The rail network also had a signal passed at danger alarm, which alerted the control center when the red signal was passed. That alarm did activate. However, by the time it was received and acted upon, the train was already too close to stop. The warning came too late to make a difference. Radio calls were then made to the train, but they were not emergency calls. They did not clearly communicate the urgency of the situation, and there was no response from the driver before the collision occurred. At the same time, another risk was developing. A third freight train was allowed to continue into the area on a nearby track. The control officer was not yet aware that a collision had occurred, and there was no immediate system requirement to stop other trains automatically. This created the danger of a second collision. That outcome was narrowly avoided, but it showed how quickly one failure can place others at risk. When investigators examined this accident, they looked closely for anything sudden or obvious that might explain what went wrong. They found no evidence of a medical emergency. There was nothing blocking the driver's view, and there were no signs of distraction inside the cab. The signals were working, the weather was clear, and the train itself was operating normally. What remained was something far quieter and harder to see. The driver had not had enough sleep in the days leading up to the journey. The train was being operated in the early hours of the morning, around 2 o'clock, a time when the human body naturally wants to rest. This period is known as the body's lowest point of alertness during the day and night cycle. Fatigue does not mean falling asleep at the controls. It often shows itself in more subtle ways. Reaction times become slower. Attention narrows. Important details can be missed, even by experienced and capable people. Over time, the effort needed to stay fully alert becomes harder to maintain. According to the investigation, this quiet build-up of fatigue played a key role in what happened next, reducing the driver's ability to notice and respond to a change that mattered. After the investigation, several changes were made to reduce the risk of a similar accident happening again. These changes focused mainly on how people work and how warnings are handled. One of the first changes involved night operations. Extra limits were placed on driver-only services during the early morning hours when fatigue risk is highest. In some cases, additional staff were added and closer monitoring was required. Rules were also updated so that when a train passes a red signal, emergency radio calls must be made immediately. These calls now clearly warn other trains in the area and leave no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. Fatigue management was strengthened. New processes were introduced to better identify fatigue risk, improve rest planning, and provide clearer guidance for both drivers and supervisors. Training programs were updated as well, with a stronger focus on human performance, alertness, and signal awareness. However, some things did not change. There was no automatic train protection system installed on this line. Trains are still not automatically stopped if a red signal is missed. There is also no universal system that enforces signal compliance across the network. Much of the safety still depends on human observation and response. If you have thoughts, experiences, or views on what should change or what should not, we invite you to share them in the comments. This documentary is not about blame. It is about learning, remembering, and deciding how safety should be built for the future.